The oath card was smaller than Naomi Calder had expected the first time she'd seen one 6 years ago, and it had not grown any larger since. A rectangle of gray assembly composite, warm from the hands of everyone who'd held it before her in the line, with a single sentence etched into it in standard script, and beneath that, in the human lettering the conquered authority had decided, generously, to keep in circulation. I accept the ascension of Earth into the compact, and my place within it. She stood in the third row of the tribute square in Conquered City, in a crowd of 400 people from Calvin Valley who had all been told attendance was voluntary, the same way rain was voluntary if you didn't mind what happened to the crops. Above the dais, banners the color of dried blood hung from poles twice, the height of any building Larkspur Cross had owned before the assembly rebuilt half of it into something with better sightlines. Compact officers in gray plate stood at the square's four corners, not looking at anyone in particular, which was its own kind of instruction. Conquered City had grown up around the old town square the way ivy grows over a fence post, not replacing it so much as absorbing it, so that the tribute square Naomi stood in now shared a boundary with streets that still, underneath the assembly's wide processional avenues and pale civic architecture, followed the exact lines the original Larkspur Cross planners had laid down 200 years earlier. She had grown up watching that overlap happen a little more each year. A market lane paved over with compact composite, a schoolhouse converted into a settler registry office, the old grain co-op's loading yard fenced off and rebuilt into a depot with assembly banners hanging where laundry lines used to run. 10 years of that slow absorption had taught her, more thoroughly than any lesson in a Concord-approved schoolbook, exactly how patient an occupation could afford to be when it believed, with total confidence, that it already owned the ending. 10 years today, said the woman next to her, an older neighbor named Delia Osgood who ran what remained of the valley's dairy co-op. She said it the way you'd note a birthday you'd rather forget. 10 years, and they still make us hold the card like we might forget what's written on it. 46 worlds before us held it the same way, Naomi said, because she'd read the plaque outside the Hall of Concord so many times the words had stopped meaning anything. Every one of them signed by year 10. That's the whole point of today. They're not asking us, they're confirming a number. At the front of the square, Proconsul Darian Voss climbed the 3 low steps of the dais with the unhurried economy of a man who had rehearsed this exact walk in front of a mirror more than once. He was younger than the office suggested, sharp-jawed, silver threading early through dark hair, and he carried himself like someone who had spent a career being the youngest person promoted in every room and had never once let anyone forget it. Behind him, projected onto the Hall of Concord's broad face in standard script and its scrolling translation, ran the tally the assembly kept for every tribute world in the compact. Years to full ascension, 47 of 47 worlds, median 6.2, maximum 10. Earth's own bar sat at the top of the chart, pinned exactly at the ceiling of that maximum, the way a grade sat pinned at the edge of a passing mark. 10 years, Voss said, and his voice carried across the square without visible effort, amplified by relays bolted to the old town clock tower the assembly had left standing, deliberately, as a courtesy that had never once felt like one. 10 years since the Ninth Fleet's descent. 10 years of patience the assembly did not owe this world, and extended anyway, because the reclamation and assimilation protocol has never, not once, on any of 46 prior worlds, required more than a single generation to complete its work. Today Earth joins that record. Today, on Ascension Day, this world signs itself into the compact freely, and the protocol's perfect account continues unbroken. He said freely, the way a man says a word he has decided will not be questioned in his presence. Naomi's father stood 2 people down the row from her, close enough that she could see the line of his jaw tighten the way it did whenever Voss said a sentence like that one. Elias Calder had lost his left arm to a compact strafing run in the 2nd month of the invasion, back when Calvin Valley still had a militia instead of a memory of one, and in the years since he had built a second, quieter life keeping bees in the hedgerows, the assembly hadn't bothered to survey. He did not speak in tribute squares. He had told Naomi more than once that speaking in tribute squares was how good people ended up on lists, and that the valley needed him alive and unremarkable more than it needed him righteous and gone. He had never, in 6 Ascension days, refused to hold the card. This year, when the line moved forward and the young conquered clerk held out the reader for him to press his card against, Elias Calder did not move his hand. "Sir," the clerk said, not unkindly, a boy who couldn't have been older than 19 and wore his compact tissue uniform like it still didn't fit right. "The reader needs contact." "I know what the reader needs," Elias said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The square had already gone the particular quiet it went whenever something happened that wasn't supposed to. "I've given it contact for 10 years. I'm not giving it an 11th. Naomi felt the ground move under a life. She'd spent 10 years building carefully flat. "Dad," she said, low, urgent, "don't." "I'm not asking you to do anything, Naomi." He didn't look at her. He was looking at the clerk and past the clerk at Voss, who had gone very still on the dais the way a man goes still when a number he has already reported to his superiors threatens to change under him in public. "I held this thing for a decade because I had a daughter and a son to keep breathing, and I told myself that was a good enough reason to keep lying with my hand. It isn't. It never was. I'm just the first one old enough and expendable enough to say so out loud." Voss came down off the dais himself, unhurried, the crowd parting the way crowds part for men whose unhurriedness is the whole threat. He stopped an arm's length from Elias Calder and studied him with an expression that held no anger at all, which was somehow worse than anger would have been. "You understand what today's broadcast means," Voss said, quiet enough that only the nearest dozen rows could hear it, which Naomi understood, even in that moment, was itself a kind of mercy she hadn't earned and didn't want. "Every tribute world in the compact watches Ascension Day. 46 worlds signed on schedule. If Earth signs today, it becomes the 47th, and the protocol's record stays perfect, and every governor on every other difficult world gets to point at this footage and say, even they came around, eventually, quietly on time. If Earth does not sign today, if one man's hand becomes the reason the record breaks on camera, in front of 9,000 worlds, then I have a very different broadcast to explain to the assembly, and you have given me a very specific problem to solve in front of an audience." "Then solve it," Elias said. Voss studied him a moment longer, then turned, walked back to the dais, and gave an order so brief Naomi almost missed it under the sound of her own pulse. "Clear the square. Ascension proceeds tomorrow instead, quietly off broadcast with whoever's willing. And find out," he added to the officer beside him, in a voice meant to be overheard, "who else in the Calvin Valley delegation has been advising this man on what to say in front of a camera." That night, 4 compact patrol vehicles came up the valley road to Larkspur Cross with their running lights dark, the way vehicles moved when whoever had ordered them didn't want the valley waking up to watch. Naomi heard the engines from her bedroom window and was already pulling boots on before she understood why her hands were shaking. By the time she reached the square, the patrol had already gone house to house along Founders Row with a list, an actual list, printed on Concord Authority letterhead, that a young lieutenant read from under a hand light while soldiers checked names against faces. Elias Calder's name was near the top. So was Grant Osgood's, Delia's husband, a beekeeping partner of Elias for 11 years who had never once, as far as Naomi knew, said an unwise word in a public square in his life. So was Praveen Eggers, who ran the valley's only working mill. 11 names in total, and the lieutenant read every one of them in the flat, unhurried voice of a man reading a delivery manifest. "Persons of established sympathy," the lieutenant said, when Naomi shoved close enough to demand a reason, close enough that a soldier's arm came up hard across her collarbone to stop her. Detained pending review in connection with an armed action against compact personnel 6 days ago. Standard procedure. Return to your residence. They marched the 11 men into the Founders Hall itself, the old stone meeting house at the square's north end, built before the invasion, before the assembly, before anyone in Calvin Valley, now living, could remember a version of Earth that didn't answer to somebody else's calendar, and posted a cordon around it 2 soldiers deep, and told the gathering crowd that this was a detention, temporary, administrative, nothing more. Naomi did not see the fire start. She heard it, a soft percussive cough from somewhere near the hall's old boiler room, the kind of sound that could have been anything, that she would spend years afterward turning over in her memory trying to decide whether it had been an accident or a decision. And then she saw the light change behind the hall's narrow windows, orange where it should have been dark, and she understood before anyone said a word that the building was burning with 11 men locked inside it. The cordon did not move. Naomi threw herself against a soldier's raised arm 3 times before Theo's hands closed around hers hard enough to leave bruises she'd carry for a week, pulling her back before she could take a 4th run at a line of compact plate that would not have noticed her at all except as an inconvenience to step around. She screamed her father's name until her voice tore, and no one on the other side of that cordon was permitted, or willing, to answer her. It took 3 hours for the hall to finish burning, and another hour after that before the cordon finally allowed the valley's own bucket lines close enough to matter, by which point there was nothing left to save, and everyone standing in the square understood that had always been the actual timeline the patrol intended. Naomi Calder was 24 years old, and she spent the worst night of her life on the wrong side of a line she could not cross, with her 11-year-old brother's small hands locked around her arm, watching the only building in Larkspur cross older than the occupation collapse into itself 1 beam at a time, while Delia Osgood knelt in the square's cold gravel 3 feet away, making a sound Naomi had never heard a person make before and hoped, with everything left in her that night, never to hear again. Proconsul Voss did not attend the fire. His official statement, broadcast the next morning on the chorus feed alongside a rescheduled, off-camera signing of 41 oath cards from residents who had not been in the tribute square the day before, described the incident as a tragic structural failure during a routine security detention under investigation, and noted that the protocol's record for Earth remained, for the Assembly's purposes, administratively intact, pending completion of Ascension at a later date to be determined. Naomi read that statement 3 times before she understood that Voss had not simply killed her father. He had filed him. The valley buried what the incinerator hadn't taken 3 days later, in the cold ground behind the second chapel, 11 markers in a row because 11 families had nowhere else to put their grief, and no one from the conquered authority had objected, which Naomi understood even then was its own kind of message. Mourn quietly, and we will permit it. She stood through the whole service without hearing most of it, Theo's hand in hers, watching Delia Osgood place a jar of her husband's own honey on Grant's marker, because it was the only thing of his hands had made that summer, and thinking, with a clarity that frightened her, that she had spent 10 years being grateful for exactly this kind of quiet. Pravin Ager's daughter, 16 and dry-eyed in a way that unsettled Naomi more than tears would have, found her afterward by the chapel wall. My father used to say the valley kept 2 calendars, she said. The Assembly's and the real one. He said the real one was the only one that mattered, because it was the only one that remembered who you actually were once the other one finished writing you down as a case number. She looked at the row of markers. I don't know what to do with that now that he's on both of them. Naomi didn't have an answer for her. She went home that night and sat at her father's workbench among the hive frames he'd never finished repairing, and did not sleep, and did not cry, because some part of her had already begun, without her permission, doing the cold arithmetic of what came next. Warrant Officer Ansel Rourke found her 4 days later, not because she'd gone looking for the root hold, but because the root hold had spent 6 years watching every household in Calvin Valley closely enough to know exactly which ones were about to break, and which direction they'd break in. He was 63, gray-bearded, missing 2 fingers on his right hand from the same campaign that had taken Elias Calder's arm, and he found her in the burned husk of the Founders Hall at dusk, sifting through ash for something she hadn't let herself name yet, with Theo asleep on a folded coat in the doorway because he refused to be anywhere she wasn't. "You're not going to find him in there," Rourke said, not gently, because gentleness was not a thing he trusted himself to offer convincingly anymore. "Whatever's left went into a compact incinerator 2 days ago. Standard disposal protocol for detention casualties. I'm sorry. I wanted you to hear that from a person instead of a rumor." Naomi did not stop moving her hands through the ash. "You knew him." "I served with him. Before the invasion, and after, until his arm ended. That part of his life and mine kept going a while longer without him." Rourke crouched at the edge of the wreckage, careful of his knees, careful of the boy sleeping 10 feet away. "I run something your father knew about and never joined because he had 2 children, and I never asked a man with 2 children to give me more than information. We called ourselves the Root Hold, back when we still had numbers worth naming. We're smaller now, not gone." "What good is smaller and not gone?" The words came out of her flat, exhausted past the point of grief into something colder. 6 days ago, somebody from your root hold killed 2 soldiers on the North Bridge. 11 men burned for it. My father wasn't even the one you needed protecting. He just stood up in a square and said a true thing out loud, and now he's ash in an incinerator log, and your ambush is why." Rourke didn't flinch from that, which she would later understand was the first thing about him that made her trust him. "You're right that the ambush and the fire are connected. You're wrong about the shape of it. Voss didn't burn that hall because of 2 dead soldiers. He had a dozen quieter ways to answer that, and he knows it. And so do I. He burned it because your father refused a reader in front of a camera. On the one day of the year, the Assembly is actually watching this planet, and Voss needed the story to be about anything except his own record breaking on schedule. 11 men died so a proconsul's promotion file could keep saying no active resistance requiring escalation. That's the whole reason. Not the bridge, him." Naomi sat back on her heels in the ash, her hands black to the wrist, and looked at Theo's small sleeping shape in the doorway, and understood, with a clarity that felt less like a decision than like a debt coming due, that the version of herself who had spent 10 years keeping her head down so her family could keep breathing had died sometime in the last 3 hours, along with the last of what the fire had left to burn. "Teach me," she said. "Teach you what?" "Whatever you taught him, whatever you were going to ask him for someday if he'd had one less child." She looked up. "I don't have a militia's worth of numbers. I have 2 hands, an irrigation engineer's certificate the Assembly never bothered to revoke, and a brother I am not leaving anywhere you can't see him. Those are my terms. Take them or don't." Rourke was quiet long enough that she thought he might refuse her. "I had a son," he said finally, not looking at her, looking instead at the black ribs of the Founders Hall against the dusk. "Younger than you are now, when the fleet came down. He didn't wait for anyone to teach him patience. He went at a compact convoy with 3 friends and a stolen rifle in the 3rd month of the invasion, and none of the 4 of them lived to see the end of that week. I have spent every year since then teaching people the opposite of what killed him, because I decided a long time ago that grief without discipline is just a second way of losing the people you love." He looked at her now. "I'm not going to teach you to be reckless, Miss Calder, no matter how much today has earned you the right to want that. If that's not a bargain you can accept, go home to your brother and I won't think less of you for it." "That's not what I'm asking for," Naomi said. "I watched my father decide that one honest hand was worth more than 10 years of careful silence. I don't want to throw myself at a cordon line and die loud. I want whatever the opposite of that is." "Teach me the opposite," Something in Rourke's face eased fractionally, the closest thing to approval she'd see from him for months. He reached into his coat and produced, of all things, a small paper packet of seed beans, ordinary and unremarkable, the kind any valley household kept by the jar. You know irrigation systems. You know where every buried line in this valley runs, don't you? Not just the working ones. The old ones, too. The ones the Assembly's survey teams never found because they were looking for pipe on a map that predates half of what Larkspur Cross actually built underground. I know every line back to my grandfather's time, Naomi said. Why? Because the root hold doesn't win battles, Miss Calder. We've tried. It costs more than it buys, against an assembly that can replace a company of soldiers faster than we can bury our dead. Rourke closed her ash-blackened hand around the seed packet, an old habit of his. She'd learn. He never explained a thing without also giving you something to hold on to while you heard it. We win the same way your father's bees do. Patiently, underground, in lines nobody thinks to look for, until the day the whole hive moves at once and there's nothing left for anyone to burn. The training took 11 weeks before Rourke let her near an actual operation, and Naomi spent every one of them furious at how little of it involved anything she would have called fighting. He drilled her instead on silence, how to move through a flooded culvert without her boots making the particular suck and release sound that carried farther than footsteps ever did on open ground, how to read a compact patrol's rotation from nothing but the pattern of a searchlight sweep, counted in seconds, until she could predict a gap in coverage 2 minutes before it opened. How to sit motionless in cold water up to her collarbone for 40 minutes at a stretch, because the one skill that had kept every surviving member of the root hold alive longer than a single season, Rourke told her, was the discipline to do nothing at all when doing something would feel so much better. She trained alongside 2 others that first season, Imogen Struthers, a wiry, sharp-tongued woman a few years older than Naomi who had run supply for the root hold since she was 17, and had a habit of narrating her own mistakes out loud so nobody else had to point them out for her. And Callum Ray's, quiet and broad-shouldered, a former Concord Authority conscript laborer who'd walked off a maintenance crew 8 months into his contract and never gone back, and who knew the inside of compact machinery better than anyone else in the valley, human or otherwise. Yusuf trained beside them too, though he'd been root hold adjacent for 2 years already by then, mostly running messages, and Naomi watched him relearn patience alongside her with the same stubborn good humor he brought to everything, which was, she would think later, the first thing about him that made the 11 weeks bearable. Her first real operation was a 6-liter fuel diversion off a compact supply line feeding the Concord Depot's eastern generator bank, run entirely through a culvert her own family had maintained for 2 generations, and it went wrong in the smallest possible way, exactly as Rourke had promised her something eventually would. A junction valve, Callum swore, was original Larkspur Cross plumbing, turned out, when Naomi's hand found it in the dark, to have been quietly replaced, compact composite, newer, colder, wrong under her fingers in a way that made her blood go still before her mind caught up to why. She held perfectly motionless for 6 minutes, exactly as Rourke had drilled into her, water at her collarbone, a patrol's boots crossing the great 4 feet above her head, and did not move again until the sound of them had faded entirely down the service road. "You froze," Imogen said afterward, not as an accusation, cleaning grime from under her nails in the Adami cellar with the particular satisfaction of someone recounting a story that had ended well enough to be funny. 6 full minutes, water up to your neck, a patrol close enough to spit on, and you didn't so much as breathe wrong. Rourke's 11 weeks, Naomi said, were apparently 11 weeks well spent. They usually are, Rourke said from the doorway, in a tone that told her that was the closest thing to praise she'd get from him that night, and that it would have to be enough. They called her the Vine within the root hold's first season, not because she'd asked for a name, but because Farha Adami's youngest son, Yusuf, 23, and built like a man who'd spent his whole life doing farm labor nobody thanked him for, started calling her that after the third supply raid she planned using nothing but the buried irrigation grid her family had maintained for 2 generations. Routes no compact patrol map showed, culverts wide enough for a person lying flat, junctions that let 4 people vanish from 4 different directions after a single strike, and never once crossed the same ground twice. "You move like something that already knows where the water goes," Yusuf told her, hauling a crate of diverted ration stock through a drainage tunnel that ran, unmarked and unmapped, directly beneath Conquered City's eastern depot wall. "Vine. Because you're already under the wall before anybody upstairs even knows you're growing." It was a small thing, a nickname born out of exhaustion and dark humor at 2 in the morning, and Naomi hated it for exactly 1 raid before she stopped hating it, because Theo, technically too young for roothold work, and technically banned from every operation Naomi ran, a rule he broke by scale of inches every week, started drawing vines in the margins of his school books, small and defiant, and she understood that her brother needed something to be proud of that Voss hadn't taken from him yet. The raids were never large. Rourke had drilled that into her from the first week. No operation costs more than it earns. No operation risks more people than the target is worth. No operation happens twice the same way. They took fuel convoys apart 6 liters at a time from culverts under the road, not enough for the Conquered Authority to declare a crisis, enough for a valley of farmers to keep their own machinery running through a winter the Assembly had priced them out of surviving honestly. They rerouted tribute grain through drainage lines that fed, eventually, into cellars the Assembly's survey drones had never once photographed, because the drones flew high enough to see roofs and roads and never once thought to wonder what ran beneath either. Voss noticed the losses before he understood their shape. 6 months into the Vine's operations, tribute yield out of Calvin Valley had fallen 11% against projection, a number small enough to blame on weather and large enough that a proconsul with a broken Ascension record already sitting unresolved on his file could not afford to ignore it twice. He sent an officer named Desin Prahl to find the leak. Prahl was thorough, methodical, and utterly unprepared for a resistance built entirely around infrastructure 100 years older than the occupation. He searched barns, questioned families, doubled patrol density on every road in the valley, and found nothing, because nothing he was looking for traveled by road. Prahl came to the Calder farm himself in the search's 2nd month, polite in the particular way compact officers were polite, when politeness was a tool rather than a courtesy, and asked Naomi a series of questions about her irrigation certification, her father's death, her movements on 4 specific nights, while 2 junior soldiers searched the barn without quite finding the loose floorboard beneath the feed bins that led, if you knew which board and which angle, to a crawlspace connecting to the culvert system 11 feet down. Naomi answered every question with the flat, grief-worn honesty of a woman who had genuinely buried her father in an incinerator log 4 months earlier, because Rourke had taught her that the only lie worth telling under questioning was the lie that didn't require you to lie about anything except your reasons. And her reasons: grief, exhaustion, a fierce private hatred of the Conquered Authority she made no effort to hide, because hiding it would have been the more suspicious choice, were entirely true. "You understand," Prahl said at the door, not quite a threat, "that a woman with your family's history is precisely the profile my superiors expect me to watch closely." "I understand that a woman with my family's history buried her father 4 months ago and hasn't slept properly since," Naomi said. "Watch as closely as you'd like, officer. There's nothing here but grief and beehives." He left without finding the board. Theo, watching from the hayloft with his heart in his throat the entire time, didn't speak again until the patrol vehicles were a full mile down the valley road. "You're spending resources chasing ghosts," Voss told him, 3 months into a search that had produced 2 false arrests, a public apology the Conquered Authority hated issuing, and not one recovered liter of fuel. Find the actual people, Prawl. Ghosts don't organize 11 raids in a season without leaving a person somewhere at the center of it. There is a person at the center of it, sir, Prawl said. The valley calls her the Vine. We don't have a face. We don't have a name. We have a pattern of losses that behaves like water finding cracks in a foundation, and I am beginning to suspect that is not a metaphor. Voss did not like that answer, and he liked even less the report that followed it 2 weeks later, when a routine equipment audit at the Concord Depot's East Gate discovered a drainage grate, human-sized, that connected, according to no survey the assembly had ever commissioned, directly to a culvert system running the length of Calvin Valley and terminating, as far as Prawl's engineers could determine before the trail went cold in 6 directions at once, nowhere they could map. Seal it, Voss ordered. Seal every access point your engineers can find, and when you're done, assume you haven't found all of them, because you clearly haven't found most of them so far. The sealing bought the assembly 4 months of quiet, and cost the root hold nothing it hadn't already planned for, because Rourke had never let the culvert network be their only route, only their first and least valuable one. The moment they find one door, he'd told Naomi the week she joined, you make sure you've already got 3 more they haven't looked for yet, and you let them feel clever about the one they found. What the sealing did instead was force a change in method that Naomi, 18 months into the fight now, understood before Rourke had to explain it to her. Raids that couldn't travel underground had to travel through people instead, and people were the one resource the root hold had always guarded more carefully than fuel or grain, because people, once lost, did not grow back the way a vine did. Naomi had met Petra Van exactly twice, both times at cross-cell coordination meetings Rourke arranged twice a year in a root cellar 3 valleys distant, and both times she had come away thinking that if the fighting ever ended, Petra was exactly the kind of person the valley would need to rebuild it. A former schoolteacher in her 40s who ran her cell the way she'd once run a classroom, with a patience that never once curdled into softness, and who had taught before the occupation. Half the adults now serving under her. You're the Vine, Petra had said, the first time they met, studying Naomi with open curiosity rather than the wary appraisal Naomi had expected. Yusuf's mother talks about you like you hung the stars. I told her I'd reserve judgment until I'd seen the work myself. By the second meeting, 6 months later, she'd stopped reserving it. Rourke's patient to a fault, she'd told Naomi, sharing a flask of something bitter and homemade in the dark. You're patient with a fuse. I like that combination. Don't let anyone talk you out of either half. Voss answered the sealing's failure to produce results the way ambitious men answered most failures they refused to attribute to themselves. He widened the punishment instead of narrowing the search. Curfew across Calvin Valley tightened from dusk to full dark within a month. Tribute inspections doubled without notice, and twice that winter Concord patrols detained a household's eldest child for a night of administrative questioning, whenever a family's tribute numbers came in short, a tactic that produced no useful intelligence and no confessions, but which accomplished, with brutal efficiency, exactly what Naomi suspected it was actually designed to do. It made every parent in the valley calculate, every single day, precisely how much resistance their children could survive them supporting. It reached her own household in the second year, on a night Naomi would not fully discuss with anyone but Rourke for months afterward. A patrol swept the Calder farm on a tip that turned out, eventually, to be nothing more than a jealous neighbor's petty grievance over a boundary dispute, and found, in the course of a search that had nothing to do with the root hold at all, 13-year-old Theo alone in the house with a hand-copied page of Concord patrol schedules he had been keeping, entirely on his own initiative, without telling his sister. Because he'd decided months earlier that watching soldiers from the hayloft was something he could contribute even if Naomi never led him closer than that. The soldiers took the page. They took Theo to the tribute office in Concord City for 6 hours of questioning that Naomi spent entirely in a state she would later describe to Rourke as the only time in the entire war she had seriously considered walking into Concord City and surrendering herself in exchange for her brother's release, whatever the cost, whatever it undid. Theo told the questioning officer, with a composure that terrified her more than tears would have, that he collected schedules the way other children collected anything else boys his age collected, out of boredom, out of a fascination with patterns, because there was nothing else to do in a valley under curfew. And the officer, unable to connect a 13-year-old's notebook to anything resembling an organized resistance, released him at midnight with a formal caution and no charge. "I'm not doing it again," Theo told her once, flat and furious at himself the night he came home. "Not because I'm scared. Because I almost cost you everything and didn't even do anything useful with it." Naomi held him until he stopped shaking, and did not tell him that night that Rourke had already quietly folded the incident into the Roothold's own operational security review, tightening, from that point on, exactly how much any member's family, even a member's uninvolved younger sibling, could independently know without anyone's permission. It was Yusuf who lost the argument about that in the spring of the 3rd year, when Petra's cell, 2 valleys over, not Naomi's, not under Rourke's direct command, attempted a raid on a Concord munitions transfer using a network of couriers that included, unknowingly, a tribute office clerk who had been informing on his neighbors for 8 months in exchange for his family's ration status. The raid failed in the worst way a raid can fail. Not quietly, not with an escape, but in the open on a road, in front of compact soldiers who had known exactly where to wait. Petra Van died there along with 6 others, and Voss's public account of the engagement broadcast, unlike the Founders Hall fire, in full with footage, described it as a decisive demonstration that the so-called resistance in the Northern Territories operates without discipline, without popular support, and without a future. Naomi watched that broadcast in the cellar beneath the Adami farmhouse with Yusuf beside her and Rourke across the room, and felt something in herself go quiet and hard in a way it hadn't since the night of the fire. Yusuf didn't say anything for the length of the whole broadcast. Petra Van had taught him letters at 7 years old. In the last classroom Calvin Valley ran before the Concord Authority folded its curriculum into the Assembly's own, and he sat through the footage of her death with his jaw locked and his hands flat on his knees, and only spoke once it had finished. "She used to say the same thing to every class," he said quietly, "that the Valley's whole history was written by people who got outlasted, not outfought. I used to think that was just something a teacher says to keep children calm. I don't think it was that anymore." "He's wrong about the discipline," she said. "He's wrong about the support, too, if he thinks 8 months of one clerk's fear is the same thing as loyalty. But he's not wrong that people are dying faster than we're replacing what we lose. We need a different kind of win, Ansel, not another convoy, something that costs him more than it costs us." "Careful," Rourke said, though not as a refusal. She'd learned to hear the difference by then. "Wanting a bigger win because you're grieving a smaller loss is exactly how Petra's cell got 6 people killed on an open road. Rage picks bad targets. Patience picks good ones." "I'm not talking about rage." Naomi pulled the Concord Authority's own tribute schedule bulletin from her coat, a document the Vines network had been quietly copying out of Concord Depot paperwork for 2 years, and laid it flat on the table between them, tapping a line near the bottom. "I'm talking about a date, Ascension Day. Not the one they held 10 years ago without him. The one they've been quietly rescheduling every year since, because they can't broadcast it compact-wide until the record shows a 100% voluntary signature rate, and they can't get that rate as long as we keep giving people a reason not to sign. Look at the projection line, Yusuf. They're 2 years from claiming they've hit it. Voss has been building toward this for a decade. His whole career is one broadcast away from either finishing or ending." So we take the broadcast away from him, Yusuf said slowly. We take more than the broadcast. Naomi looked at Rourke, who had gone very still in the particular way he went still when a plan was arriving at the exact shape he'd been afraid someone would eventually propose. Hall of Concord holds the instrument of Ascension, the actual charter, the physical one, sealed the day the fleet came down, that gets ceremonially completed the day a world signs. Everything about that building is designed to be the proof forever that the protocol worked here too. 47 for 47. If Earth is the one world where that record breaks publicly completely on the exact day, and in the exact building they built to prove it can't, then it isn't a raid anymore, Ansel. It's the end of a story the Assembly has been telling every other tribute world for 100 years. Rourke was quiet for a long moment, looking at the bulletin, at the projected date circled in Naomi's own hand 2 years out, at the daughter of the friend he'd buried in an incinerator log instead of a grave. Your father refused to put his hand on that reader, he said finally, because he decided one man's honest hand was worth more than his own safety. You're proposing we take that same refusal and burn it into the record of 46,000 years of Assembly history in front of every tribute world watching, so loud they can't file it away as an administrative footnote. He looked up. That's not a raid, Naomi. That's a war. Are you asking me to help you start one, or are you telling me you already have? I'm telling you, Naomi said, that I already lost the war I didn't start the night that Hall burned. I'm asking you to help me finish the one I did. Imogen Struthers, called in from her own cell 2 nights later to hear the plan in full, did not accept it as easily as Yusuf had. Proposing a 2-year operation with 11 compartmented cells feeding into one target, inside the single most heavily secured building on the continent. On the one day it will have the most soldiers in it has ever had, she said, laying the objection out flat on the table the way she laid out every problem without heat, because heat had never once solved anything in her experience, and she saw no reason tonight would be different. Petra's cell died because one clerk knew one piece too many. You're asking 11 people to each hold a piece of something this size for 2 straight years without a single crack. I want to know why you think that's survivable before I agree to be one of the 11. Because it isn't going to be built the way Petra's was, Naomi said. No courier carries more than she needs to survive being caught carrying it. No cell knows what any other cell is doing, only what their own 11th requires. And nothing moves through a person who doesn't already have a legitimate reason to be exactly where we need them, which means most of what we're building isn't a network of couriers at all. It's 2 years of very boring, very legal contract labor, done so consistently that by the time it matters, nobody watching us will have any reason left to look twice. Imogen considered that for a long moment, glancing once at Rourke, who offered her nothing beyond the same patient, unreadable calm he offered everyone weighing a decision this size. That's not a plan, she said finally. That's a decade of the Roothold's own doctrine, compressed into 2 years and aimed at one door. She exhaled, something that might almost have been a laugh if the subject had allowed for one. Fine, I'm in. But if any part of this starts feeling clever instead of boring, Naomi, I want the authority to say so out loud, and I want you to actually listen when I do. You'll have it, Naomi said. That's the whole point of asking 11 people instead of deciding this alone. The 11, in the end, were a stranger collection than any recruitment poster the Assembly ever printed for its own settler militia. Callum Rays, who knew compact machinery better than the engineers who'd built it. Imogen Struthers, who ran logistics with the exacting suspicion of someone who had never once trusted a plan that hadn't already survived her own objections. A retired agricultural inspector named Ren Ockhaffer, 60 and unassuming, whose decades of legitimate access to Concord tribute weighing stations across 3 valleys made her the network's quietest and most valuable courier. A pair of cousins, Idris and Layla Farrow, who ran the region's only surviving fuel cooperative and had spent 2 years diverting exactly enough for the operation without ever once triggering an audit. Yusuf, Rurk, Naomi. For others whose names never once appeared in anything the Assembly's own investigators managed to compile, then or after, because Rurk's doctrine of compartmented ignorance had done, in the end, precisely what he'd built it to do. None of them, on any given day of those 2 years, knew more than the shape of their own 11th. It was, Naomi thought more than once, an uncomfortable way to fight a war, trusting 9 people you rarely saw with a plan none of you could see whole. And it was also, she came to understand by the 2nd year, the only way a resistance this small had ever survived an empire this old for as long as it had. The 2 years that followed were the longest and most disciplined of Naomi Calder's life, and the least like anything a story about burning buildings ever made a resistance sound like from the outside. There were no dramatic speeches. There was a spreadsheet, Rurk's word for it, though it lived in nobody's hardware, only in the careful, compartmented memory of 11 people who each knew exactly 1/11th of the whole plan, and no more, on the theory that Petra Van's clerk had taught them the only lesson worth learning twice. They mapped conquered cities' power grid by working 3 separate legitimate maintenance contracts the Assembly had, with characteristic administrative indifference, allowed local labor to keep holding, because human electricians were cheaper than shipping in compact ones, and the occupation had never once considered that convenience a security risk. Naomi herself spent 11 months as a certified irrigation and drainage subcontractor for the Hall of Concord's own groundskeeping department, a job she got using papers that were, technically, entirely real, because the best kind of infiltration, Rurk had taught her, was the kind that never had to lie about anything except intent. She learned the building the way she'd once learned the buried lines under Larkspur Cross, which drainage channels ran beneath the hall's foundation from the original town infrastructure. The Assembly had built its replica city directly on top of without ever fully mapping, which service corridors the settler staff used to move between the archive wing and the ceremonial hall without walking past the honor guard, which fuel reserves fed the building's backup generators, and where those reserves sat relative to the instrument of Ascension's climate-sealed display case in the Concord archive. The work itself was tedious in a way that suited her better than she'd expected, replacing valves, clearing sediment traps, filing the same maintenance reports twice a month to a groundskeeping supervisor named Havorson Trill, an aging compact administrator who had clearly stopped finding his posting interesting years before Naomi's contract began, and treated every human subcontractor with the same distracted, incurious courtesy he extended to the plumbing. It was Trill's incuriosity, more than any clever cover story, that kept her safe. He signed her access chits without reading them, walked past her twice a week in the archive wing service corridor without once asking what she was doing there, and complained, more than once, that Earth's contract labor was the only competent thing the Concord Authority had ever assigned to his department. The nearest she came to discovery in 11 months happened on an ordinary Tuesday, replacing a corroded valve 4 meters from the archive's climate control housing, when a settler wing custodian rounded the corridor corner earlier than her schedule allowed for, and found Naomi kneeling with a service panel open directly beneath a security conduit that had nothing to do with irrigation at all. Naomi didn't freeze. Rurk's 11 weeks had burned that particular failure out of her by then. She simply held up the corroded valve she'd actually removed, showed it to the custodian with the mild, put-upon irritation of someone annoyed at compact plumbing rather than afraid of being caught near it, and said, "Whoever installed this thought copper and compact alloy age the same way. They don't. I've told Supervisor Trill 4 times." The custodian, uninterested in a stranger's plumbing complaints, moved on without a second look, and Naomi did not allow her hands to shake until she was 3 corridors away. There were, in those 2 years, A handful of evenings that belonged to nothing but themselves. Naomi would count them later and find there were only 6, which struck her as both too few and exactly right. Yusuf found her on one of them sitting alone on the Calder farm's back step, past midnight, unable to sleep after a day spent memorizing generator schematics until the numbers blurred, and sat down beside her without asking permission, the way he'd been doing since they were children too young to know the valley would ever need either of them for anything harder than harvest work. "You don't have to talk," he said. "I mostly came to make sure you were eating something that wasn't cold tea and worry." "I'm fine." "You're allowed to not be fine, Naomi. 2 years of this and I've never once heard you say the word tired, and I know for a fact you are, because I am, and I sleep considerably more than you do." He didn't reach for her hand, not that night, though it would be months yet before either of them said anything about the several other nights when he had. "I just don't want you to forget, somewhere in the middle of memorizing a building, that there's a person under all this planning who's allowed to want something for herself when it's over." Naomi looked at him for a long moment in the dark, at a friend who had followed her into a war neither of them had chosen, for reasons that had stopped sometime in the last 2 years, being only about the war, and let herself, for exactly that one evening, want something that had nothing to do with fire or archives, or a card she'd never pressed against a reader. "Ask me again when it's over," she said, and he did not push for more than that, and it was, for 6 months afterward, the closest either of them came to speaking the rest of it aloud. Theo turned 14 during those 2 years, tall enough now that Naomi sometimes forgot, mid-argument, that he'd been 11 and small, and clinging to her arm the night the Founders Hall burned. He was not part of the plan. She had refused that with a finality that ended 3 separate conversations before they could become arguments. But he had grown into exactly the kind of quiet, watchful, furiously competent teenager that a valley under occupation for 14 years produces. And the week before the operation, he found her checking a satchel of tools in the Adami cellar and set a folded page on the table without a word. It was a hand-drawn map of the drainage culvert beneath the Hall of Concord's east wing, more accurate than the one Naomi's own 2 years of subcontracting had produced, because Theo had spent the last 4 months, without telling anyone, cross-referencing old Larkspur Cross Municipal Survey records with the Hall's public groundskeeping schedule, working out access windows a 14-year-old had no business working out. "I'm not asking to come," he said before she could speak. "I know the terms. I just wanted you to have the right map when you go. Dad used to say the valley kept its best secrets underground. I figured you'd want the newest one." Naomi looked at the map, and at her brother, and felt the particular ache of a person recognizing, for the second time in her life, exactly why a stubborn parent spends years building something nobody thanks them for. Voss, in that same span of 2 years, had his own arithmetic to solve. Compact Intelligence reported the Vine's raids had slowed to almost nothing after the culvert sealing, a fact he took, wrongly, as evidence of a resistance finally breaking under sustained pressure, and reported upward, correctly this time, as the first real progress toward an Ascension day he could finally schedule with confidence. 2 years of quiet was, to a proconsul measuring his career against a chart of 46 other worlds, exactly what victory was supposed to look like. He set the date for the 10th anniversary +2 Ascension broadcast. The earliest his own projections showed a defensible signature rate, and requested, for the first time in his tenure, that the Assembly send a compact archivist to certify the ceremony in person, rather than by remote relay, because a proconsul this close to redeeming a broken record wanted a witness the Assembly itself would trust without question. The request went up the Concord authorities' chain to a consul named Ovid Brawl, a man Voss had never met in person, and had spent 11 years trying to impress through nothing but flawless quarterly reports, and the reply that came back was shorter than Voss would have liked and considerably colder. "Your predecessor's file shows a decade of delay. this office has tolerated on the strength of your projections alone. It read. The Assembly does not send an archivist to certify success it can already assume. It sends an archivist when a proconsul's own superiors have begun to wonder whether his account of a world can still be trusted at all. Do not mistake this for confidence in you, Voss. Mistake it for the last measurement you will be given before this office recommends a different administrator entirely. Voss read that message twice, alone in his office overlooking the tribute square, and did not share its exact wording with anyone on his staff. He understood, with the particular clarity of a man who had built an entire career on being the youngest person promoted in every room, that Cyril Cade's arrival was not a courtesy the Assembly was extending him. It was a verdict the Assembly had already half-written, waiting only for a broadcast to confirm it. The Assembly sent Cyril Cade. Cade was 211 years old by compact reckoning, an archivist third class whose entire career consisted of standing quietly at the edge of ceremonies on tribute worlds and recording, for the permanent Assembly record, that the protocol had worked exactly as designed. Cade had certified 41 of the prior 46 Ascensions personally. Cade had never, in 2 centuries of service, filed a report that said anything other than * proceeded as anticipated. Cade arrived on Earth 6 days before the ceremony, was given a guest suite in the Hall of Concord's settler wing, and spent those 6 days doing what archivists did on every world, reviewing the proconsul's projections, touring the ceremonial hall, and out of a habit 2 centuries deep that Cade would have struggled to explain to anyone who asked, walking, alone, in the early mornings, through whatever part of a tribute world's capital still resembled what it had been before the Assembly arrived. On the second morning, that walk took Cade past a groundskeeping crew clearing a drainage grate near the archive wing's east entrance, and Cade, out of the same idle, 2-century habit that had never once produced anything worth recording in 41 prior certifications, stopped to ask the young human contractor kneeling at the grate what she was repairing. Naomi did not know in that moment that she was answering a question from the Assembly's certifying witness. Cade wore no ceremonial marking that morning, only plain compact gray, and introduced no title. "Sediment trap," she said, not looking up from the valve in her hands, because looking up too quickly at anyone in this building had stopped being a habit she trusted herself with months ago. This whole system runs on infrastructure 100 years older than the building on top of it. Nobody who designed the replacement ever really understood what they were building over. "That sounds like more work than most contracts require," Cade said. "It's not really a contract," Naomi said, straightening enough to meet the archivist's eyes without quite deciding to. "It's just the ground. You learn it or you don't. Most people who come here don't bother." Cade said nothing further and walked on, and would not understand the full weight of that exchange until 4 days later, but some part of the encounter lodged itself regardless. The particular calm of a young woman kneeling in compact soil discussing infrastructure, nobody who designed the replacement ever really understood, in a voice that held no fear at all, in a building the Assembly had spent a decade insisting was theirs. On the 4th morning, in what remained of old Larkspur Cross beyond Concord City's rebuilt perimeter, Cade found the memorial the Valley had built without Concord authority permission on the ashes of the Founders' Hall. A low, unadorned stone marker, 11 names cut into it by hand, no Assembly seal, no standard script translation, nothing but the names and the dates, and beneath them, a single line in the human lettering the Concord authority still, generously permitted. They did not sign. Cade stood in front of that marker for 11 minutes. The recording, later, would show the timestamp exactly, and then returned to the Hall of Concord and did something no archivist third class had done in living memory. Cade opened a private log, unlinked from the official ceremonial file, and began writing an account that no proconsul had requested and no protocol required. "Query for the permanent record," the log began, unresolved after 41 prior certifications. What does it mean that this is the first world where I have found, unprompted, a monument to the people who refused? 2 days before the ceremony, with the archivist already installed in the settler wing, and Voss's own anxiety visibly fraying at the edges of every briefing his staff attended, the Hall of Concord's Security Division rekeyed every access credential in the building without warning. A precaution Prahl himself recommended, not because either man suspected the vine specifically, but because a decade of chasing a resistance that never once left a face behind had taught the Concord authority to distrust every convenience it had ever extended to human labor. Naomi's subcontractor Chit failed at the archive wing checkpoint on a Thursday morning with 4 soldiers watching, and for 3 full seconds she understood, with a calm that frightened her more than panic would have, that 2 years of patient work were about to end in a security office instead of a burning hall. "Recredentialing lag," said the checkpoint clerk, a young compact enlisted man barely older than Theo, scrolling through a queue of similarly failed chits with visible boredom. "Half the contract staff got caught in it. Supervisor Trill's been complaining about it all morning." He waved her through without a second glance, already reaching for the next chit in line, and Naomi walked the length of the archive wing corridor afterward at a pace she made herself hold steady, because Rourke's 11 weeks had taught her that the difference between a close call and a catastrophe was very often nothing more than a soldier's boredom, and it was never a thing worth trusting twice. She spent that night rebuilding, from memory alone, every contingency the compartmented plan had assumed a functioning subcontractor credential would still provide 2 days later, and did not sleep until she'd confirmed, with Callum and Imogen both, that the operation could proceed without it if it had to. It did not, in the end, have to. But Naomi carried the weight of those 3 seconds with her into the ceremony itself, a reminder, if she'd needed one, of exactly how much of 2 years of careful patience had been standing, the entire time, on the width of a bored clerk's attention span. The Ascension Day broadcast went live across the compact's 9,000 tribute worlds at the hour the Assembly's own astronomers had calculated as the median viewing window for the greatest possible simultaneous audience. A detail Voss had personally requested, because a proconsul this close to redeeming a decade-old failure wanted every governor on every difficult world watching in real time when the protocol's record turned, at last, unbroken. Theo Calder, 15 now, sat in the cab of a grain hauler parked a half-kilometer from Concord City's eastern perimeter with a handset pressed to his ear and Rourke beside him, because Naomi had lost that particular argument for the first time in 2 years. Not about whether he'd fight, which she had never once conceded, but about whether he'd wait somewhere close enough to matter if the maps he'd drawn turned out to be wrong. "If something in that building doesn't match what I gave you," he'd told her the night before with a flatness that had ended the discussion, "I want to be close enough to fix it, not 3 valleys away finding out afterward." Rourke had backed him quietly, which was the only reason Naomi had agreed at all. Naomi Calder was 3 levels beneath the Hall of Concord's east wing when the relay lights along the service corridor flared to signal the broadcast had begun, moving through a drainage culvert her grandfather had poured concrete for 70 years before an assembly survey team ever photographed the ground above it, with Yusuf 4 meters behind her and 6 more roothold fighters spread through 2 other access routes Theo's map had confirmed clean that morning. The first obstacle wasn't a soldier. It was a maintenance bulkhead compact engineers had installed 8 months earlier, after the culvert sealing, exactly where Theo's most recent survey had shown clear passage, and for 4 seconds Naomi would remember as some of the longest of her life. She thought the entire operation had ended before it began. Then Callum Ray's, 2 positions back, ran his hand along the bulkhead seam and found what 8 months of compact indifference to human contract labor had left behind. A service override panel, unlocked, because the crew that installed it had never imagined anyone underground would know it was there to look for. It cost them 90 seconds. It felt, in the moment, like an hour. 90 seconds, Yusuf murmured, once they were moving again, and I aged about 9 years standing in that pipe. Save the rest of the aging for after, Naomi said, but her hands, she noticed, were steadier than her voice. Above them in the ceremonial hall, 400 selected residents of Calvin Valley, chosen, this time with careful conquered authority screening, for compliance rather than representation, stood in neat rows before a dais where Voss, in ceremonial gray, stood beside the climate-sealed case holding the instrument of Ascension. And beside him, silent, watchful, recording everything for a report she had not yet decided how to write, stood Cyril Cade. 10 years and 2, Voss said, his voice carrying through relays across 9,000 worlds now, through a compact vast enough that some of the audience receiving his words would not finish hearing the sentence for another several minutes of light lag, and would never know that the version of events he was about to describe stopped being true before it reached them. 10 years and 2, and today the record the Assembly has kept for 46 worlds before this one extends to 47. Earth signs. Earth joins. The protocol. The generators failed at 1944. 11. Standard reckoning. Exactly the moment Naomi's team reached the fuel reserve junction her 11 months of legitimate subcontract work had mapped down to the meter, and exactly 9 seconds before the backup relay. The one Voss's engineers had installed specifically to prevent a power failure from interrupting a broadcast this important, failed as well, because that backup relay ran. As Naomi had confirmed with her own eyes 8 months earlier, while replacing a drainage valve 4 meters from its housing, off the same fuel line as the primary. The ceremonial hall's lights did not simply go out. They guttered, the way lights gutter when something upstream has been deliberately, precisely starved rather than merely cut, and in the half-second of confused dark before the hall's emergency lighting caught, Naomi Calder came up through a service grate behind the dais with 6 years of grief and 2 years of patience behind every motion, and found herself, for the first time since the night the Founders Hall burned, standing close enough to Proconsul Darian Voss to see the exact moment he understood what was happening. You, Voss said, and to his credit, Naomi would think later in the strange calm of hindsight, he did not look afraid so much as furious at his own arithmetic, the particular fury of a man watching a number he had reported as final refuse, at the worst possible moment to hold still. The vine. My name is Naomi Calder, she said. My father's name was Elias. He held a card in this square once and refused to press it against a reader, and you burned 11 men for it and called it a structural failure. I've spent 2 years learning this building well enough to know exactly which lie of yours to pull first. Behind her, Yusuf and the rest of the team were already moving, not toward Voss, not toward the honor guard scrambling in the half-dark, but toward the Concord Archives climate-sealed display case, where the physical instrument of Ascension sat behind glass built to survive 100 years of ceremonial handling, and absolutely nothing designed by people who understood accelerant chemistry, the way a valley of farmers who'd fought fuel scarcity for a decade understood it. Stop them, Voss said to the honor guard, and then to Naomi with something that might almost have been respect if it hadn't been buried so deep under fury. You understand this changes nothing. I have soldiers in this building. I have a fleet in orbit. Whatever you burn tonight, the Assembly sends another archivist, writes another report, and Earth's ascension proceeds on a rescheduled date exactly the way it did after your father's fire. You keep saying that like it worked the first time, Naomi said. It didn't. It cost you 2 years and a consul who's already decided your career is a liability. It cost you a witness you brought here yourself, standing 3 meters from you right now, listening to every word. She didn't move from the display case, though her pulse was loud enough in her own ears to nearly drown out the honor guard scrambling into the dark corridor behind him. You wanted a broadcast that proved the protocol works even on a world like this one. You're about to get a broadcast. It's just not going to say what you paid for. Voss's hand went to the sidearm at his hip and stopped, because the honor guard behind him had not yet reformed in a corridor with no working lights, and a proconsul who fired the first shot of an incident he still might survive, on camera, in front of 9,000 worlds, understood, even through the fury, exactly what that single motion would cost him if it went even slightly wrong. Naomi watched him make that calculation in real time, watched the war between what he wanted to do and what a decade of institutional caution had trained him never to do, and used the half-second it bought her to move. "No," said Cyril Cade. The word landed in the half-dark hall with a strangeness that made even Voss turn. 2 centuries of archivist training had built into Cade an instinct for silence in exactly these moments, an instinct that had held through 41 prior ceremonies without exception, and broke now, for the first time, in front of the one camera relay that had survived the generator failure on independent battery power, still transmitting, still watched in the growing light lag delay, by governors on 9,000 worlds who had tuned in expecting a number to turn from 46 to 47. "Cade, this feed is compromised," Voss said sharply, half turning from Naomi for the first time since she'd surfaced behind the dais. "Cut the transmission. This is not the certification the Assembly authorized." "The Assembly authorized me to record what actually happens," Cade said, and did not look away from the failing case, from the fire beginning to climb the archive's shelving, from the honor guard still tangled in a dark corridor they couldn't clear fast enough. 211 years, proconsul. I have never once been asked to record what actually happens. I have been asked 41 times to confirm what your predecessors already intended to be true before I arrived. That is not the same instruction, and I find, standing here, that I no longer intend to treat it as one. I certified 41 ascensions before this one, Cade went on, and the voice, translated automatically into standard script across every receiving world, carried none of the practiced neutrality the position required. I have never, in 211 years, filed a report that deviated from proceeded as anticipated. I am filing one now. Let the permanent record show that on the 10th anniversary +2 Ascension attempt for the world-designated Earth, the ceremony was interrupted by an organized human resistance, operating with the tacit support of a population the proconsul's own projections described as pacified. Let the record show a monument exists in this world's capital, unauthorized and uncensored, that reads, "They did not sign." Let the record show I am the archivist who finally wrote down why. Voss lunged for the archive corridor himself then, past his own stalled honor guard, close enough to the display case that Naomi understood, with a clarity that cost her nothing to act on, that this was the moment 2 years of patience had been built to reach, not a speech, not a symbol, but a single choice made by a single furious man trying, even now, to save a broken number by force. She met him at the case. It was not a long fight, and it was not afterward, one she could describe cleanly even to Rourke. A matter of seconds, of Voss's hand closing on the case's edge and Naomi's closing on his wrist, of Yusuf's shoulder catching the proconsul from the side hard enough to put him on the marble floor of a hall his own assembly had built to be indestructible, of the case itself, struck once, twice, by the tool she'd carried through a drainage culvert for exactly this purpose, giving way on the third strike in a spray of composite glass that cut her forearm to the bone, and that she would not feel until an hour later. The accelerant went in fast, the way 2 years of fuel scarcity discipline had taught a valley to make small amounts do large work. The instrument of Ascension, a slab of compact alloy engraved with 100 years of the Assembly's own certainty, caught in under a minute, the ancient script along its surface warping and blackening in a way no ceremonial handling had ever once been designed to survive, and the fire, once lit, found the 70-year-old original Larkspur cross timber the Assembly's rebuilt Hall of Concord had been constructed directly over without ever once surveying what it was standing on. It moved through that old wood with a speed the building's compact architects, trusting entirely in the alloy and composite of their own century, had never accounted for at all, climbing archive shelving, curling along ceiling beams the Assembly had never known were beams instead of ornamental facing, filling the ceremonial hall with a heat and a light that reached, within minutes, every camera relay still transmitting. Naomi Calder stood in the growing light of a building the Assembly had raised specifically to prove Earth could never do exactly this. Her cut forearm forgotten, her breath ragged with smoke already thickening the air, and watched it burn on camera in front of 9,000 worlds, while Voss lay pinned on the marble by Yusuf's knee and Cyril Cade kept recording and kept transmitting and did not stop. And 400 selected residents of Calvin Valley who had come to that hall expecting to be made an example of instead watched, in the flickering orange dark, the example turn around and become theirs. "Go," Rourke's voice said in her ear, flat and urgent over the relay column had kept alive against every reasonable expectation that it would survive the generator failure at all. "Naomi, it's done, go." The withdrawal took 4 minutes, Rourke's timing, rehearsed until it lived in muscle memory rather than thought, out through the culvert Theo had mapped, into the drainage system Naomi's grandfather had poured before any of them were born, gone from the Hall of Concord before the Honor Guard's own reinforcements finished forming up in a corridor that no longer had working lights to form up in. Yusuf came out of the archive corridor a half-step behind her, a shallow cut open above one eyebrow from a piece of the display case's composite glass, grinning despite it in a way that had nothing to do with the pain. And together they moved through the dark, the way 2 years of drilled silence had taught them to move, counting turns instead of words until the culvert opened onto the drainage outfall a half-kilometer beyond the perimeter, where the night air tasted like smoke even that far from the fire. Theo was already out of the grain hauler's cab and running toward the outfall before Rourke could stop him, and he reached Naomi before she'd finished climbing clear of the pipe, both arms around her hard enough to reopen the ache in her cut forearm, which she did not mention, because some pains were worth not naming in front of the person who'd earned the right to cause them. "I saw the relay lights fail from here," Theo said, voice cracking with an urgency he was clearly furious at himself for not controlling. "I didn't know if that meant it worked, or if it meant something had gone wrong on your end." "It meant it worked," Naomi said, and held onto her brother in the drainage ditch's cold mud for a long moment, watching over his shoulder, the orange glow climbing above Concord City's rooftops, where a building the Assembly had built to be indestructible was busy proving on camera exactly how wrong that word could be. Voss was not killed. Naomi had decided that 2 years earlier, in an argument with Yusuf, she'd won by a margin of 1 vote, on the grounds that a dead proconsul became a martyr for the Concord authorities' next appointee to avenge, while a living one, publicly humiliated on a broadcast watched by 9,000 worlds, became something the Assembly's own bureaucracy would have to explain and keep explaining for years. Yusuf had let go of him at Naomi's word, in the ruin of the archive corridor with the fire already climbing the shelving behind them, and Voss had not thanked either of them for it. He had simply stared at the burning case, at Cyril Cade still transmitting, at a career built on a perfect number that no longer existed, with the particular stillness of a man watching every version of his own future disappear at once. He was recalled to the core worlds 11 days later, his file marked, permanently and irrevocably, with the only Ascension failure the protocol's 100-year record had ever produced. Consul Brawl's office issued no public statement about the recall. It did not need to. A footnote followed Voss instead, into a provincial administrative posting on a minor tribute world nobody in the Concord Authority considered worth a proconsul's title, and then, 2 years after that, out of the Assembly's service entirely, in a resignation the official record described as voluntary, and every channel the root hold still maintained afterward described, with considerably more accuracy, as inevitable. The Assembly did not withdraw from Earth in the weeks that followed. Empires that old did not move that fast, and Naomi had never believed they would. But the broadcast could not be unmade. Cade's report, filed under full archivist authority, and impossible for the Assembly to suppress without contradicting 2 centuries of the Archivist Corps' own credibility, went into the permanent record exactly as spoken, and it traveled, in the strange light-lagged way compact broadcasts always did, outward across 9,000 worlds over the following months at the literal speed of the signal itself, which meant that for every world it reached, there existed a first night when whatever governor or garrison commander administered that world watched, for the first time, an archivist's own trembling, unscripted voice break 100 years of perfect record on camera, and understood, watching it, that the story their own tribute populations had been told for a century had just stopped being true, anywhere anyone could still deny it. Within a season, tribute worlds 3 systems over that had never once dared to test their own Ascension projections began quietly, cautiously, filing petitions. The conquered authority had no clean precedent for refusing. A garrison on a world called Ithren, whose name Naomi would not learn until Rourke's contacts brought it back to her a year later, staged its own quiet, unarmed refusal at its next scheduled Ascension ceremony, citing, openly, in the petition's own language, the Earth precedent. The protocol's perfect account was broken. It could never again be cited, on any of the Assembly's 9,000 worlds, as unbroken, and no amount of conquered authority messaging afterward ever fully closed that particular door again. Cyril Cade did not return to certifying ascensions. The Archivist Corps, unable to discipline a report it could not contradict without unraveling its own 2-century claim to impartial record-keeping, reassigned Cade instead to a newly created oversight position, auditing prior Ascension files across all 46 previously certified worlds. An assignment several conquered officials had intended as a quiet demotion, and which Cade, according to the one message that ever reached Calvin Valley through channels Rourke declined to explain, treated instead as the only honest work available in 2 centuries of service. 3 of the 46 files Cade reopened, Naomi would learn years later, were never closed cleanly again. The new proconsul the Assembly sent to replace Voss arrived within the year, cautious in a way her predecessor had never once needed to be, and within 18 months Calvin Valley's tribute quota had been quietly reduced twice, never announced as concession, always filed as revised regional assessment, which Rourke found grimly funny in a way he never fully explained to Naomi until the 3rd reduction came through, and he finally said once that watching an empire rewrite its own arithmetic without ever admitting why was the closest thing to justice a occupied world usually got to see in one lifetime. The compact garrison stationed permanently in conquered cities shrank by 1/3 over that same period, official reasoning unstated. The pattern unmistakable to anyone who'd spent a decade learning to read Assembly cautioned the way Naomi had learned to read a searchlight sweep. Calvin Valley rebuilt the Founders Hall a second time, on the same ground, with the same 11 names carved into a new stone beside the old one. And this time the conquered authority, chastened, watchful, no longer administered by a proconsul with anything left to prove, did not object. Delia Osgood cut the ribbon at the doorway herself, an honor the Valley gave her without discussion, and Pravin Igor's daughter read all 11 names aloud from the new stone in a voice that did not shake, which Naomi understood, watching her, was its own kind of victory nobody would ever put in an Assembly report. Imogen Struthers stood near the back of the crowd that day, arms crossed, watching the new stone go up with the same exacting suspicion she brought to everything, and when Naomi caught her eye across the square, Imogen allowed herself, for just a moment, something that on anyone else would have been called a smile. Callum Reyes had gone back to fixing compact machinery for a living, quietly, competently, the same as always, though he kept a fragment of the display case's composite glass on a shelf in his workshop that he never explained to customers who asked. Ren Akafer retired from tribute weighing entirely within the year. Content, she said, to have spent her last useful service carrying exactly the right things to exactly the right people at exactly the right times. The Pharaoh cousins kept the fuel cooperative running, and never once, in all the years afterward, spoke publicly about where 2 years of careful shortfalls had actually gone. Naomi Calder stood at that second dedication 8 months later, her forearm scarred in a line she'd carry the rest of her life. Theo beside her at 15 and taller than she remembered him being allowed to grow. Rourke a few steps back with his hands, folded the way he always stood at things he'd rather not be seen being proud of, and Yusuf close enough that his shoulder brushed hers without either of them making anything of it in front of the valley. Someone asked her, afterward quietly, what she'd say to the assembly if she thought they were listening. Naomi looked at the new stone, and the old one beside it, and thought of a small gray card she had never, in the years since, pressed against anything. They thought we'd surrender, she said. We burned their civilization instead. Not all of it, just the piece of it built to prove people like us always eventually would. She touched the scar on her arm once, the way you touch a thing to confirm it's still real. That was always going to be enough.